So we've got things set up now so that when we get close to an enemy it chases, and when we get far enough away he leaves us alone. We've got it so that we take damage when he hits us, but we don't have any way to fight back. And wouldn't it be fun if we could walk around the map and collect swords and shields so that we can do some battle with those enemies? I think that's what we'll do next. Let's get started. Now the first step in making equipable items will be to actually create those items. So let's right click over in our hierarchy, go to Create 2D Object, Sprite, and we'll make a square. I'm going to start by just using my Rect tool to resize this so it looks a little more sword-like. And I'm also going to head into my sprite renderer and change the color to a nice gray tone. That'll make it look a little bit more like I'm brandishing some steel here. At this point, I'm going to need to add a collider so that I'm actually able to pick this up when I collect it. And I'll add a box collider, 2D. And I'm also going to set this one to a trigger. That way I can walk over top of it, I won't bounce into it, that sort of thing, but I'll be able to still pick it up. Now at this point, I've got a bit of a sword that I can pick up, but I don't necessarily know where on my player I want it to pick up, and I specifically am going to want it to equip on the side of my character, a little bit underneath him, so that it looks like it's actually in his sword arm. So to do this, I'm going to actually have to create that sword arm on my player. So I'm going to head up to my player here in the hierarchy. I'm going to right click and I'm just going to create an empty, and we're going to call this one sword hand. Now if I double click on the sword hand, it'll zoom me in on it, and I can use my move tool to make sure that that is over here on the right of my player. And what I want to do now, I'm just going to do a test. So I'm going to grab my sword here, which I'm going to quickly rename to be an actual sword. And I'm going to make it a child of the sword hand. Now you'll notice at this point it hasn't moved at all. If I move my player, it will move the sword, but the actual sword itself is not on the player, and so we want to fix that. So to do that, I'm going to actually just zero out my position. So now it is sitting exactly on my sword hand, and you'll notice that that's not exactly what I want to happen. So I'm going to just grab my sword hand and move it forward so that the sword is appearing about the way that I want it to for my player, so that it looks like he's actually walking with a sword in hand. So my sword hand is now there. My sword is equipable and works well. I'm going to now unparent that sword, set it down below, and then just move it away from the player so that I can equip it later on. Now it's time for us to get scripting. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and create a new C# script. And I'm just going to call this one item pickup. All right, and we're going to get started by creating a couple of variables up at the top. The first is going to be a public bool that we will call sword hand equipable. This is just going to be a checkbox in Unity that will show whether or not this item can be picked up by the sword hand. And later on, we'll add one for the shield hand as well. We're also going to create a transform variable called sword hand, which will be how our sword finds where it's supposed to actually be equipped to on the character. We'll now head down into our start function, and what we're going to do is make it so that our script is able to find the sword hand's transform without us having to drag it into a box in Unity. To do this, we're going to use two calls. The first is going to look for the actual game object called sword hand. Next, we will look within that object to find the specific component of the transform. At this point, you can head down below your update function to create a new onTriggerEnter2D function. Remember, we made our sword set as a trigger, and this function will be called anytime something comes within the range of that trigger. This one's a bit of a mouthful with all of the syntax, but you can allow Visual Studio to generate it for you by pressing Enter. At this point, we want to make one little modification and add an if statement, because we don't want this function to be called anytime an enemy hits the sword or something like that, but only when the player moves within the trigger. And the other thing we're going to do is we're going to check to see which hand we actually want to put into. So we're also going to check to see if sword hand equipable is true. So if the player bumps into this item and sword hand equipable is true, then we're simply going to get this item and we're going to go transform.setParent to sword hand. And all this is going to do is it's just going to make it so that this object now becomes a child of the sword hand. The other thing we're going to do, we're going to type an else in here, and we're not going to be using this at this point, but later on when we create a shield, we'll be putting the shield's information in there. So let's at least set it up so it's easy to do later on. Now when we come below this, there's one thing left to do. At the moment, this will make it so that our sword becomes a child of the sword hand. The only problem is it doesn't set the location of the sword. So the sword will actually stick to whatever bumps into it. So if the player's head bumps into it or his butt or whatever, it's just going to stick there. And that's definitely not the effect that we want with our sword. So we're also going to type in one more thing. We're going to set the sword's transform, which just means we're going to look into its transform component. And we're going to set its local position. Now, we've done some position work before, but never local position. And all this means is that we're not going to set its position on the map, but simply its position in relation to its parent. And what we want to set it to is a vector 2 dot 0. And all that means is that it will immediately go to the same position as the sword hand and set itself to 0, 0. Just like we zeroed things out when we were looking at our transform and trying things on, our code will now zero it out so that it lands exactly on top of our sword hand. And once I get back here, I'm going to click on my sword, go down here to add component, and we're going to add that new item pickup that we just did. And yes, we want this one to be equipped to our sword hand, so we will click that box. My player can now approach the sword, and even if we approach it on the left side, so it's on the shield hand, you'll notice that it pops right into my right hand so that it works just nicely. All right, we're halfway there. Next up, we're going to actually create our shield. Now, a little bit of a shortcut here. I'm actually just going to head to my hierarchy and click on my sword. I'm going to hit Command D to duplicate it, and I'm going to move the duplicate over here. Now, I'm going to rename this one as a shield. But because we haven't programmed any sword-specific things in there, we can just make a couple of little changes to make this into a shield. So the first change that I'm going to do is I'm going to use my rect tool to resize this a little bit and make it kind of feel a little more shield-like. The other thing I'm going to do is make it so that it is sword hand equipable. Well, no, it is not. Now, we also have to make a couple of little changes in our script. Now, at this point, we are going to need to add a new transform, and in this case, it's going to be our shield hand. So private transform, and we'll call this one shield hand. Now in Unity, we don't actually have a shield hand yet, so I'm going to click on my player in the hierarchy, right click, and we're going to create an empty, and I'm going to name this one shield hand. I want to use my move tool to set that over on the left side of my player. And now what I'm going to do is we're going to do a test like we did last time. I'll take my shield and make it a child of the shield hand. And then I'm going to zero out the transform so that it is at a vector 2, 0 in relation to that hand. There we go. Now that looks about right, but it's a tiny bit lower than I'd like it to be. So I'm going to actually move my shield hand up just a little bit and in as well. There we go. I think I like the way that looks. You'll notice that the shield itself is still zeroed out, which is what we're going to want to do in our code too. I'll now take the shield off of my player, and we'll move it away from him so that he can pick it up later on. We've created our transform for the shield hand, and now we need to make sure that this code actually knows where to find the shield hand. So I'm actually going to just copy the code we used for our sword hand, and just a couple quick little changes. We can make this one into shield hand. And it's going to find the object called shield hand. Now down below, once again, we're going to check to see if our player has collided. Excellent. And if it is sword hand equipable, it will go in the sword hand. But if it's not, then we're going to go transform.setParent, and we're going to put it into our shield hand instead. Remember, shield hand is just a reference to the position of our shield hand. We can save that now. And now when we test our game, I can bump into the sword and it equips to the sword hand. And even if I use my sword hand to hit this shield, it pops right into the correct hand. All right, we've got a sword and shield. In our next tutorial, we'll take a look at how to animate them so we can swing the sword and eventually start dealing some damage.